everybody. We're here today with Bob Reed from Edge Philanthropy. The purpose of this interview is to discuss key takeaways from our latest research-based publication. So Bob, let's start with questions. We just published a new research-based article, this time on place-based grant making. Where did the evidence in the article come from?
Well, Jimena, as you know, Mallet Reed and I were the research team on this particular project and the co-authors of the publication. Where we found our evidence was through an examination of practices from 91 U.S. foundations. We did not draw evidence outside the U.S., but we did draw context from discussions with a work group from the Association of Charitable Foundations in the United Kingdom focused on place-based grant making, and also the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal in Australia. And we found that our findings were very similar to what they were learning as well.
Wonderful. But what was the intended purpose of the article?
So we wanted to report the findings from our research on place-based grant making. There is, as you know, far too little research on foundation practices, and our research team wanted to bring new empirical discoveries to the field. Our articles, as in this case, but typically are peer-reviewed and published in academic journals, and so they have a pretty high standard for achieving publication. This is what Edge Philanthropy attempts to do, at least in part. We avoid temptations to opine on philanthropic practice or issues related to the field, and instead seek to bring research evidence to the field.
Great. And I'm sure that the audience would like to know, what is place-based grant making?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that we had 3 research questions that guided our investigation. And of course, we were not limited to these research questions, but they essentially provided the basis for our investigation. And they included the following. Is place-based grant making practical for foundations not physically located where grants are made? And that came from discoveries in the literature about a lot of emphasis on embedded foundations, those foundations that are physically located inside the communities they serve, as opposed to work of foundations who are located somewhere else who are trying to work in a specific place. The second research question was, do local and non-local foundations approach place-based grant making differently? And thirdly, we wanted to know whether or not non-local and local foundations played well together when their grant making geographically overlapped. So with respect to your question about what is place-based grant making, it varies significantly from a more traditional form of grant making in that it is focused on the needs, desires, and circumstances of specific communities. It's kind of like an ethnographic engagement within the communities served. It's where grant makers put themselves at the center of the geography that they want to work in and really develop deep relationships. When it's well done, communities view a funder as a local institution, equivalent to being a stakeholder in local change.
So how is place-based grant making different from other styles of grant making?
Good question. So, Jimena, it is place-specific rather than thematic in scope. So thematic kinds of grant making might focus on certain categories of interest, like maybe education reform, healthcare, social services, arts and culture, or many other areas of thematic interest, because when attempting to do place-based philanthropy, funders have to understand how communities identify, prioritize, and approach both problems of concern to them and in the co-creation of opportunities to make improvements. So it requires a deep level of engagement. It is highly relational and is not especially transactional. It demands local ownership of projects and often involves experimentation through co-creation with local stakeholders. So when a foundation, for example, is involved in thematic kinds of grant making, they very often will do an extensive review of research on how to move the needle in a specific area of interest. And they will bring forward models for attempting to achieve that change. That's not how it works in place-based grant making. Instead, in place-based grant making, there is this effort to really understand how communities themselves see their needs, their interests, and their circumstances. It is highly attentive to local cultural norms and formal and informal leadership dynamics.
So what are the unique challenges in place-based?
Place-based grant making is a highly nuanced form of philanthropic practice because it requires very special attention to local circumstances and development of intimate relationships. And this takes time. This is not the kind of thing that foundations can do from an arm's length relationship. They can't just simply drop projects into a community. They literally have to be physically present. They have to develop relationships. They need to understand communities from the perspective of local stakeholders, not just from how they think about what their areas of interest might be and how they might approach trying to achieve change. Foundations typically located in communities tend to have considerable advantages with respect to place-based grant making because they already have pre-existing relationships of consequence with local stakeholders. They know both formal and informal leaders. And sometimes in communities, informal leaders actually possess more power and more influence than do formal leaders. So when foundations come from outside the community, they might tend to think institutionally around leadership. So they might think of talking to the mayor, maybe the city manager, leaders of local nonprofits. And those are important players for sure, and they are important stakeholders. Local foundations tend to think about people who are providing leadership from behind the scenes, the people who have a longstanding level of credibility in the community, in addition to people who are institutionally related to the community's leadership. They know their communities exceptionally well. They have these deep pre-existing relationships, whereas non-local foundations are sometimes kind of top-down in the way that they formulate their grant strategies. They very often have done a great deal of review, a very rigorous level of review with respect to the issues that they see that a community needs to address. And they will have highly developed models and theories of change that they want to bring to the table that actually can be quite helpful to communities. However, if a community does not frame problems in the same way that an outside funder might frame, it's very difficult to get local ownership. And local ownership is absolutely fundamental to place-based grant making. You know, there's an old saying, how many foundations does it take to change a community? And the answer is only one, but the community has to really has to want to change. So local foundations tend to be much more bottom-up oriented. They are organic. They are more likely to defer to local informal and formal leaders rather than to impose with a level of rigidity ideas about how to approach certain problems that a community needs to deal with. They, however, can sometimes lack in rigor relative to how their grant strategies are formulated. So there's a radical difference between how non-local foundations tend to approach grant making, even in a place-based context, versus more locally based embedded foundations.
The article provided 9 recommendations for foundations interested in place-based grant making. Can you please summarize those recommendations?
You bet. So Jimena, as you said to begin with, these are about key takeaways. We really encourage people to read the article, and we've made it available, as you know, under the resources tab of the Edge Philanthropy website so that people can easily access it. There is a lot more data than what we can cover in a short video. But that said, let me just say that there were 9 recommendations, 7 of which have to do with how to approach grant making, 2 of which are recommendations to the field itself. So let me go through the first 7, which have to do with how to think about place-based grant making. One is there needs to be a commitment to local presence. The one question that we did ask is it practical for non-local foundations to be engaged in place-based grant making? And the answer is absolutely. Non-local foundations can play a very helpful role. They just have to be very careful about place-based circumstances. And one way to do that is to dedicate some time with key representatives of the foundation, maybe a program officer or whoever else, to be on the ground for a while, developing local relationships. This requires a level of patience because it may take time. The development of a relationship or several relationships may need to occur before identifying what to work with the community on, because you don't want to feel like or be perceived as an outsider riding in to rescue a community. That can be disparaging to the community and disrupt trust, which is absolutely critical. Therefore, you have to calibrate the length of engagement that is going to be required. And I will tell you that what we learned in our research was that foundations notoriously underestimate how long it takes to do place-based grant making. And so you have to be very thoughtful, very careful about giving yourself enough runway to be able to formulate, once you agree upon what the challenges and opportunities are, to formulate strategies that have local buy-in and also benefit from hopefully good evidence-informed strategies. And so very important to think about being local for some period of time and having a time horizon of commitment that is reasonable for this kind of grant making. Of course, there has to be a genuine community-centric approach. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that foundations have to abandon the knowledge that they accumulate through review of research, et cetera. It may mean, however, that they need to be very careful about their vernacular, to not use foundation-specific language, to use terms that will be understood and embraced on a local level, that they have to understand that there is a bit of a dance that has to occur with local leaders in building trust and creating a convergence of thought process about opportunities and challenges confronting communities, as well as strategies. They really need to carefully reconcile the differences in approach that are used by non-local foundations versus local foundations when the two overlap. And this is something that does not happen automatically. It has to be an intentional effort. There has to be time dedicated for the multiple foundations working together, getting to know each other, to understand their concerns, their interests, their thoughts, and to build relationships. Beyond that, We know that there has to be considerable project flexibility when you are doing place-based work. Place-based work, it cannot be fully scripted in a boardroom or in a program officer's office somewhere in some remote location. It is a dynamic process that has to occur that incorporates local perspective, local cultural norms, etc. And so we learned that one of the things that had been successful for some foundations was that they built in considerable amount of flexibility, the ability to adapt around strategy, and even in terms of budget, putting in place a contingency budget line item that was substantial enough to deal with unanticipated challenges, but also opportunities. There has to be a sense of shared governance. We know from our other research that we've done, Humana, that there is a power differential that too often exists between grant seekers and grant makers. And it's just the issues and concerns related to the difference in financial resources and the referent power that goes with that. Well, we found in our research that that's not just limited, that power imbalance is not just limited to the beneficiaries of grants and the grant makers, but also between foundations of disparate size. Larger foundations, even if they are not intended to throw their weight around, sometimes can be viewed as throwing their weight around by smaller foundations. And so talking things through, making sure that there is a shared approach to governance. One of the things that our participants told us that was very important is that projects have a governing group, and that governing group needs to include representatives of the funders, representatives of the leadership of the community, and that everybody should have an equal vote. Because if votes are formulated based upon the level of financial contribution to a project, that furthers the difficulties of the imbalance of power. Lastly, an issue we called locus of control. What we were told by too many program officers of very large foundations that were not local was that they were not given enough delegation of authority to be able to engage people on the local level and to be able to adapt and make changes. They were held too accountable to models developed in their corporate offices when the models sometimes didn't actually work well on the ground. And that felt by local folks, including local funders and local leaders, like an effort to colonize the community rather than to engage the community in a fashion that demonstrated respect and partnership. In terms of the field, we had two recommendations. One is that we need to acknowledge that while there is growing interest in place-based grant making, this is a relatively new form of practice. And we think we've made a significant contribution through this article. And I hope that people will read the article and see the level of detail that came from our findings. But there's a whole lot more work that needs to be done. This form of philanthropic practice needs a great deal more study in order to get better at it. There are folks who think that place-based grant making can only be performed by local embedded funders. I would submit to you our research says that's just not the case. But there has to be a very careful, thoughtful approach to place-based grant making that overcomes some of the unique challenges that confront foundations that are not physically located in the communities that they serve, as well as some of the challenges that can confront foundations that are physically located. So the local and the non-local foundations can actually be very, very helpful to each other in developing more effective place-based grant making. Lastly, we did a research project on rural philanthropy and on foundation-to-foundation collaboration. That article also is available on our website under the resources tab. And we found that foundations are not a group that ordinarily effectively collaborates from foundation to foundation. There's a lot to be learned in this regard. And we know because we had to borrow, there's so little research in the space in terms of foundation practice. We had to borrow findings from research in the business community. And what we learned was that collaboration actually might be contemplated and conceptualized in a boardroom or maybe in a corner suite for the executive offices, but it is operationalized between frontline people who are exchanging between organizations who have to work together. And what we have learned, and I've already mentioned this once, is that the people that we interviewed who are on the front line do not feel they have the freedom necessary to achieve genuine collaboration. And as a result, the failure of collaboration sometimes is interfering with the ability to do, certainly the effectiveness of place-based grant making. So those were our key recommendations. Those are not all of our findings, as you know. We detail findings much more granularly in the article itself.
Absolutely. And that's why we urge people to read the article, and it could be found in the Edge Philanthropy website in this section that is intended to provide an array of free resources to grant makers. With that, I want to thank you for your time and all the valuable information and knowledge that you shared today with us.
Well, and thank you, Jimena, and thank you for your contributions to this research. It's a pleasure to work with you, and I appreciate the effort that you put into doing this interview.
Likewise.